All right, welcome back to the morning show here on the Rise News Amplifier. Yoseni.
I'm Adesua Omorwan.
And I'm Shaitan Atigari. Rainy morning it is in Lagos.
All right, very exciting days. Rainy morning it is. Goodness me, from VI down here, 3 hours. Normally it will take you about not less than 10-15 minutes on a good day, but
Lagos, on a good sunny day, it's traffic laden. So you can imagine with the rains and the potholes and gorges that are now being fixed. Hopefully they'll fix them in good time. We'll begin to have better driving days.
Like I said, we all did 007 driving this morning. None of us here, including I guess Kate, none of us here was left out. We all did 007 driving. Some even had to trek. You'll know those people when the time comes. Never Quite the Inside as a Nigerian memoir. There's a book that describes the author's love affair with Nigeria as a country. It's partly a memoir, travelogue, management practice, corporate Nigeria, you know.
The 406-page book touches on difficult and sensitive issues including corruption, ethnicity, multinationals, complacency, and of course the social-political relationships between foreign nationals and the citizens.
His career has spanned over 30 years of involvement in developing markets, mostly in Africa. He has been a former managing director of Promasidor Nigeria Limited, managing director of Guinness Nigeria PLC, and International Equitable Association, IEA.
All right, joining us now is Chief Kit Richards, member of the Order of the British Empire, OBE, and serves on the board of several industry groups. Business Day newspaper on the development board of Pan-Africa University as the Lagos Business School. In recognition of his selfless work with various communities, he has several chieftaincy titles. He's also a fellow of the Lagos State Polytechnic.
Well, before we get started, let us take a listen to what Nobel laureate Professor Wole Soyinka had to say about the book at yesterday's launch in Lagos.
Never Quite an Insider, Memoirs of a Ghetto Blaster. We mostly see that peculiar species known as, before I continue, it's amazing, he picked on a passage, which in fact I cite in here. I'm getting worried about you. There's many similarities. You're worrying. Anyway, we mostly see that peculiar species, the expatriate. You see them as they really are, or if you prefer, see them as they be. On festive occasions, the wedding, child naming ceremony, retirement party, chieftaincy conferment, funeral outing, simply on social occasions. I rely mostly, of course, on the testimony of media photos when they are talked out in local traditional dress, registering varying degrees of adjustment, unease, discomfort, self-mockery, and/or sense of duty, and capacity for endurance. At such occasions, you can see it written on their faces. You just wait until my pubmates in Shropshire see me in this costume. Actually, it's more likely to read, if you ever catch me again in this Agbada of America outfit, call me a so. You can eventually read on their faces images of that longed-for release when they can get back to some rational office clothing or after-hours tennis shorts at the club, nursing a cold beer or perhaps Guinness, since we are likely in Guinness territory here, going by the author's business and vigilant affiliations. In and out of their comfort zone, however, the word expatriate at once identifies and simultaneously alienates them in relation to their temporary or adopted home. Here is our own author's take on that defining sartorial infliction. I quote, "I harbor a suspicion that there's actually a subtle practical joke in the gift of local dress. He, that is the white recipient, will be told by his Nigerian friends that he looks fine. But there will be a snigger, there will be sniggers, mostly by his expat colleagues, behind his back. As always, in this book, mildly buried within that seemingly straightforward point of view or of the physical sartorial torture is a sociological part. Here it comes. I quote, "The next practical joke by gift is the full agbada. This is the ubiquitous outfit worn by big men all over the West Coast. Traditionally, it consists of trousers with a cord at the waist, usually with a matching ankle-length long-sleeved shirt, but always topped up with the voluminous and free-flowing agbada itself."
Well, Nobel laureate Wale Soyinka, Professor Wale Soyinka speaking yesterday at the launch of the book, and we do have joining us now the author himself, Keith Richards. Many thanks for joining us this morning. Before we dig into the book proper, because you had to do some trekking to get to the studio this morning, like Rufai hinted our viewers earlier. Everyday Lagos. You first arrived in Nigeria in 1981.
Correct, yes.
Now, as someone who has worked and lived in Nigeria, I just want to get your perception of governance so far. What do you think?
Is there governance? No. Being serious, as I say in the book, I'm very grateful that I was in consumer goods. I didn't have to do business with business or even particularly do B2B, business to other businesses. So we never had to, if you like, bribe a consumer to drink Guinness or use truck soap or drink cowbell milk. So we had to deal with regulatory authorities. And one of the things I tried to talk about in the book was it's much more effective, first of all, to do things properly. Because if you make mistakes, you open the window to extortion and opportunism. And then secondly is you build strong relationships. I built strong relationships with the DGs of most of the regulatory authorities. They knew we were serious. We knew we didn't cut corners. And I think, that made things a lot less difficult. But clearly, this is an environment where there are genuine issues doing business. We see Nigeria's score in ease of doing business has not improved. We get excited if it moves up 1 or 2, but we're still in the bottom quartile perpetually for doing business. And yet we need inward investment.
I'm sorry, because I was also reading in 1981 when you had to come as a visitor, you're also working with the Crowns, a British organization where you had to come and recoup debts from Nigeria.
Yeah.
And you talked about how that taught you patience. I found that hilarious because you had to wait in government offices, the bureaucracy, the bottlenecks involved from 1981 till now. Do you think we have grown? Is it any different to do businesses with Nigerian government?
Nigeria's definitely grown. I mean, there's a lot of things that have changed. I mean, one of the biggest changes is technology. So, back in those days, if you got into a car, you were gone for 2 weeks. There were no even landlines. Those were the days that if I wanted to ring back to the office, I used to have to go to a Nitel, queue up, for 3 hours. Then they would say, booth number 3. You would go to number 3 and you would have your 3-minute call. Mm-hmm. So clearly, internet, mobile phone technology has made things a lot easier. But it's also made things more difficult. There's more, harassment. And then we see now, of course, things like threats to start shutting down the social media space by government is a worry.
Okay, let's dive straight into this. I mean, maybe it's poetic justice. The first time you got into this country was 81. That was just on the cusp of President Shagari's re-election. And we had Ibrahim Babangida coming in, taking the reins from President Muhammadu Buhari. So you saw the early days of President Muhammadu Buhari. This book too is coming out. President Muhammadu Buhari is still president. A lot of people will say Nigeria changed tremendously in the 80s. In terms of monetary value, in terms of the economic disposition and the likes. Is it all still the same for you when you look at what the 80s was like, through your prism?
Well, I think so for example, just take the role of the middle class. So the military did a lot to start destroying the middle class, the civil service, things like that. But I think in terms of the professionals, medical profession, the academic profession, education, all declined drastically in the 80s. And then also in 81, it was almost parity to the dollar, the naira. I can remember getting a taxi from Broad Street to Federal Palace for 50 kobo, shared, or 1 naira if I kept the taxi to myself. And so the middle class could travel, and you had a strong middle class in Surulere, parts of Yaba. And then that was completely destroyed. That's when there was this massive exodus in the 80s, and then during the 90s with the Bacha, and the naira slid. And then, of course, we had the resurgence, we had hope with democracy. A lot of people came back from the diaspora. When I was at Guinness, I think we recruited 12 Nigerians from overseas and brought them back. And they formed part of this new middle class that started building in Lekki, created, suddenly loads of coffee shops and pizza places and restaurants and bars and clubs. But now, I think there's a threat to the middle class. Again, the slide of the naira, the security issues that we have everywhere, and I see a lot of the middle class now struggling to educate their children, to look after their parents in health terms. And I think there's a lot more pressure now, again, for Nigerians to start going back to the US and UK.
I want to take you on this. Let's just make it a little bit colorful this evening. It's already Friday morning. I want you to talk about your relationship and your understanding of a man that defiled time in Nigeria. And that's your very good friend, Fela Kuti.
Well, I didn't know Fela, so I'm very close to Seun, and I love Femi's music.
The father.
But to my utter horror and my shame, I never made it to the original shrine and met Fela. Yeah. I feel somehow through, later studying and knowing his family that, almost that I did, but I didn't.
So, trickling down now to Seun, your relationship with Seun, and your time in Guinness and what you did for the entertainment industry. I mean, because we can start, narrowing that down and start counting all the things. I mean, most people you give a chance, Michael Powers, my friend Udeme is a great man commercial, and it goes on and on and on. You just want to talk us through this before we go for a quick break, because that was really captured in the book here.
Well, I think it's very simple. When I came, Guinness was quite a serious company, and I think we needed to be in the entertainment business in the broadest sense. Drinking is about having fun. It's about creating social opportunities and engaging. And
so just hold that thought. We'll come back. We'll segue into that question again. And I'm sure Shaita would like to take you up on some things. We'll be right back.
Perfect.
Right, wonderful times right here. Still on the morning show on Arise News, and we're talking to Kit Richards, and we're talking about his life. He's got a new book out, in case you missed it. It's called Never Quite the Insider. Quite a bulky one, 406 pages. And we're talking about what you did, for the entertainment sector. in Nigeria, how Guinness was in the vanguard of a lot of great things. Relationships with the likes of the late Jaya Bodere, the raves, the work you did with the likes of the Two-Face, or the unknown Two-Face Dan, and some other acts. Can you just talk us through those stories?
Well, when I came in, there was a lot of focus on football. And then already they'd started the Michael Power adverts. And then it just so happened that the film came out in my time. And I talk about the reasons for the film. Some of the CEOs of the in-market operations thought it was a bit too much money. We should spend more on just running basic promotions. But I thought, well, it's coming, so let's make the most of it. Let's hype it and have a lot of fun. And then I also thought football tended to be very focused to, a single demographic, if you like. Whereas music appeals to everybody. You've got different kinds of music, people that like jazz, people that like Afrobeat, people that like R&B. So you can cover everybody. And of course, that's what we did. So with Guinness, we had, Wycliffe came out, and he was just...
That was the first time he came to Nigeria?
Yes, it was. And his first time in Africa. It was emotional for him, and he was just a joy to work with. And then we did the more softer side, R&B, with Gordon Spark. We had Boys to Men, which was one of my favourite gigs because it was like a love fest, When you come, everybody was swaying. The guys had their arms around their girls, and the vibe. And then when it finished, instead of the normal kata-kata where everybody's pushing to get out, everybody was just absolutely in the vibe and were just moving slowly. I couldn't believe it. And it shows you the power of music. So that's what I wanted to have happen,
Okay, so you described this book as a love affair. Your love affair with Nigeria. I also wanted to just touch on that for a bit, because then you also said that your experience stayed with you like a shadow, and it made you, your being here made you consider the effects of racism. Now, as someone who has been here for 20 years plus, and you've had to shuttle between, Nigeria and other countries, what would you say the effects of racism have been in this period?
Well, I mean, one of the things that became very important to me was understanding the culture and the history, and I'm very passionate about that. That's one of the things that I do now I've retired. I like to read about. And of course, what's alarming is, the colonial powers deliberately sought to denigrate any culture, any sense of worth of the people that they came in. You couldn't have slavery if the people that they were enslaving were deemed to be humans and Christians and share the same values. So they had to be denigrated to excuse slavery. So that's the basis of racism and colonialism. And of course, in a sense, working for multinationals are part of the hinterland, if you like, of colonialism. And if you're someone who thinks and then also witnesses some appalling behaviour, and I think broadly we see less of that kind of pomposity and aggressive behaviour, but there's now a more subtle form of racism through multinationals refusing to recognise the local culture and just, if you like, forcing Western mores and cultures because it's cheaper to make an advert for the whole of Africa than it is to recognise that even in the West Coast, the differences between Nigerians and Ghanaians are enormous, and you should focus on the local. So that's become more insidious.
Okay, sorry, just a quick follow-up to that. You know, I was talking about the perception of Nigeria. You know, we were going through your book during the break, and you seem to have met a lot of people in your time here. However, you find that the perception of Nigeria is still quite tainted a bit. You've been here, you've experienced what it is to be on ground, and like you said, your book is a memoir, if I do say so, to kind of let other people who is a memoir, to let other people who are out there and trying to understand how the Nigerian culture functions, they can read your book and, you know, have a broader understanding. What would you say in regards to the reception, the perception, and why haven't we gotten it right? And then secondly, I would just like to find out a few of your fond memories that you've had in the entire time that you've been here as well. Could you just share that with us?
Well, I think Nigeria's reputation, unfortunately, a lot of it has been founded on all the stories about 419 and advanced fee fraud. I mean, you know, if you're working in a business in the UK, you can get dozens of letters a year. And of course, people fall for it. It plays to their greed, let's make that clear. But Nigerians have a huge contribution. I mean, if you look at Nigerians right across the social space in the UK with politics, I don't agree with some of their politics, but, you know, people like Umar, the guy that's switched from Tories to Lib Dems in the UK. There's half a dozen Nigerians in or around the English rugby squad. Music, and Nigerian music is very popular, not just Fela, but, you know, absolutely. And, you know, I mean, WizKid filled the Albert Hall last year. So, but it just seems tainted by, you know, the stories about 419 and corruption. What I hope people understand is, you know, is not trying to do some kind of cover-up. It's to tell it like it is. And, you know, like today, trekking in, ordinary Nigerians getting to work. Ordinary Nigerians are struggling day to day to live their lives. And when you meet them and spend time with them, there's, you know, humour, grace, intelligence, as I say in the book, you know, some of my, and taking to your final point, some of my best times have been in bars or in markets right across Nigeria, you know, from Abakaliki to Suleja, you know, to Shaki, and it's all, and intelligent conversations. You sit in bars and people want to have informed conversations. I'm sure at a much higher standard that you would meet in probably most of the US and certainly in a lot of
even
Britain
better
as well.
than what you have in the US.
Yeah.
Even better.
Talking about this, you know, conversations that we need to have, you also highlighted at some point that we need to have these conversations about corruption, ethnicity, tribalism, the footprints of colonialism in today's business in Nigeria. And I wonder, in your almost 30 years spell in corporate Nigeria, what would be the biggest revelation for you that if anyone should pick this book, is going to be a shocker for them? What do you think that is?
As a Nigerian or as an
okay, well,
expatriate?
as a Nigerian, as you know, an expatriate, and even the government, and even as a government official, you know, what would be the biggest shocker?
I think perhaps the not just corruption in the private sector per se, but the role that often it's been expatriates. You know, I talk very specifically about 2 or 3 corrupt expatriates. And I always sort of think, if you're going to have an expatriate, one of the reasons that you might say that is genuine is to perhaps avoid the fact that he might get involved in nepotism or corruption. But that isn't the case. And then, of course, corruption throughout the world is facilitated by the Western banking system and by the blind eye that is turned to that kind of money coming in.
You're almost Nigerian to me, or you're Nigerian to me. You got a Nigerian passport?
Well, that's an interesting story. I applied
for a Nigerian passport.
Yep, and I went through the process, but the people were asking me for money. I refused to pay. I had a minister, I had members of Nigeria's preeminent cultural family. I had lawyers as my guarantors, and it was still an insistence that I should pay money, and I refused. And now I've just been through now I'm no longer a resident and have to apply for my visa. I've been through that hassle. I was thinking, oh, maybe I should have dropped some money, but, you know.
Okay, another thing is, you've crisscrossed Nigeria.
Yes.
You've gone to most parts. I mean, it's not out of place if you can do a sort of like a Michelin star kind of thing about Nigerian food and award restaurants. Yeah. The question is, and before we go on this quick break, will be interesting places, the beauty of Nigeria.
Yeah.
The interesting places you've gone, the food, the memories. Let's talk about food memory. Your love affair with food and drink and places in Nigeria.
Okay, well...
And maybe women?
Well, maybe we'll leave that one till later. I mean, I do talk a little bit. You know, I did have a long-term relationship with someone, but I just felt it was unfair to name her specifically and her family and what have you. Because that was an issue. People abused her for having, a high-profile affair with an Oyibo, and then also the fact that she didn't bring people for jobs and contracts and stuff made it difficult for her. But in terms of food, I wish I could say I was passionate about all forms of Nigerian food. But it's interesting, I think about it, and the trouble is, when you travel around, and the first time you meet a lot of Nigerian food, it's not necessarily in the best places. You don't tend to be first exposed in people's homes. And then, of course, the flavour's much better, it's nicer, you're not worried about the hygiene. So the first times I ate, a lot of soups would have been in...
Okay. We'll come back, we'll talk about the soups, all the soups.
Okay.
Probably Nigerian, after this quick commercial break.
Welcome back to the Morning Show here on the Rise News. We're still in the studio here with Keith Richards, a member of the Order of the British Empire and serves on the boards of several industry groups, past chairman and group MDs. He just launched a book yesterday. Professor Wole Soyinka was at that launch. Let's take a listen to what the Nobel laureate had to say about the person of Keith Richards. We'll be right back to discuss some more.
Please, I love your poetry, but when you read your own poems, you ruin those poems for you. Anytime you have to read your poems in public, please send for me wherever I am. I volunteer my services free of charge. But please stop ruining your own poetry by reading them yourself. Well, I cannot say the same for Keith. I didn't know he was such a dramatist. He's a powerful reader of his own stuff, and I'm sure other people's stuff. In fact, he told me earlier that actually had a walk-on part in which he had just one word to say. They needed an Oyibo, and he fitted the bill, and all he had to do was just say one word. I'm going to get hold of those people and let them know that they wasted an opportunity. And the next time they should give him a part really worthy of his talent. It's a real marvelous performer.
Okay.
Nobel laureate Wole Soyinka there, talking about you were seated right there. How did that make you feel?
Oh, you cannot imagine the sense of pride and gratitude I had. Can you imagine that somebody like Professor Soyinka volunteers to do your review and is nice to you and speaks about you as if, that you're on the same level of him as him? It is ridiculous. I keep thinking this is not happening, and you know, it was lovely, and I feel completely humbled by him.
When you were writing this book, what was your goal, and what sort of reactions did you envisage from the society and the group of people you talked about, the sectors of the society you talked about? And we'd like you to read a part of the book for us, but also tell us, you know, what sort of reactions did you envisage that this book? Because I was reading some part, and you know, you had colleagues who thought you were a sellout, you messed up the whole corporate entity with the actions you took or your inactions. So,
well, I wasn't quite sure. People said to me, "Who are you focusing? If you write a book, you have to focus on."
Yeah.
But I think I always really had 2 or 3 different motives, and I was pointing at different people. You know, when I wrote the column Outside or Inside, it was well received by Nigerians who enjoyed the perspective. So I always had that in mind, and I also wanted to show the genuine story about Nigeria to people who'd never been here. I mean, some of my friends who have read it, who are ignorant about Nigeria, are really surprised at the complexity, because they have these simplistic views of, you know, what Africa is. So if I've educated a bit for people back, then that's great. Then I also wanted to entertain. And then if you're going to write about yourself, you have to have an ego. So I'm sure, you know.
So what's your favorite part of the book?
Well, it's hard to say. I don't know. You know, I think some of the corporate stories are probably more important, if that's a word. But I think the fun bits that I've enjoyed writing are those little stories, you know.
So just do us the honor of reading from this. I mean, well, so we can see the dramatist himself.
This is just a little bit. I was rushing back to Aba, and we got to the airport. We missed the last flight to the main airport in Port Harcourt, and we got a little flight into, you remember there used to be an old military airfield right in the middle of Port Harcourt. So we got there and there was no driver. We had to get a taxi to get back to Aba, and it was getting dark, and you really don't want to be on that road after dark. So, as we disembarked, my colleague Uche went off to negotiate with the taxi driver while I waited for the luggage. As I waited, I thought to myself, shit, I hate catching taxis to Aba just as it's getting dark. Bugger, bugger, bugger. My fears were to be realised. Eventually, Uche found a taxi driver willing to go to Aba, but as they came over, I could see the driver was visibly irritated. If he had known one of his passengers was an Oyimbo, he would have negotiated a higher fare. Still, he looked fairly smart. The car was in reasonable condition, but as it turned out, no air conditioner. Fortunately, it was not dark yet. So, why didn't you tell us you didn't have enough petrol to get to Aba? Well, ask a stupid question and you get a stupid answer. Eh? After wasting daylight in the petrol station, we joined the traffic queue grinding its way up the old Aba road. With no AC and the windows open, we enjoyed the fresh smell of burnt diesel and other traffic fumes as the sweat began to bead and trickle, and the elderly Corolla dipped into potholes, played dare with trucks and Danfo buses, and ran the gauntlet of beggars and street hawkers. Bread, dried banana, little bags of groundnut all waved into your face, along with CDs, DVDs, spanner sets, Bibles, porn, handkerchiefs, anything that you can think of that you don't really need. Or if we were hungry, a quick would have bought us a choice of meat, chicken, kidney or gizzard suya, roast plantain and sweet corn, puff puff and the ubiquitous gala sausage, fresh from the cardboard box.
Wow. That sounds like the Nigeria that we all know and love.
And you know, you write this article inside out. I just had to check it now and remember, because I had a brain. I think Nnamdi Azikiwe used to write these articles called the inside stuff.
Right.
Yes. So there's this thing about having things inside and knowing things inside. But as we wrap it all up, the future for you. What's the future? You're retired now. What do you do now? You travel around and...
well, this book finishes at the end of Guinness.
Okay.
So, of course, then I started my new career of writing for Business Day, and then I was taken back into the corporate world to run Promasidor. And one of the things that I'm proudest is, you know, that I think I developed some young Nigerians who these days are senior around the Nigerian space, which gives me a huge amount of pride. So with 2 or 3 of those, Vitus, Kachi and Andrew, we're planning to write a book about how it was to work for the expatriate and how it was to manage the Nigerians. We don't think anybody's written a book, you know, that is... Most of the books have a sense of other, you know, white men, black men. And so we're planning to... That would be more of a strict corporate book.
I'd just like to ask this very solemn question. I mean, we talked about slavery, we talked about colonialism and the likes. Do you think that Britain needs to come back and apologize to us for all they have done all these years? Honestly, I mean, when you look at the deep moments, I mean, when things like Iva Valley massacre in the 40s comes to mind, the Aba women riot, do you think we still need that, you know, apology, you know?
I think so, yes. But first there has to be recognition. There's still no recognition of those things. So first is recognition, and then having recognized it, it has to be apologized for. And, you know, there's so many stories like that. And as was found out recently, the British establishment deliberately destroyed a lot of records from the colonies because they knew some of these things would come out.
And finally, just before I let you go, let's talk about corporate Nigeria. I know we've wrapped up on the book, but you did mention something you referred to as irresponsible corporate Nigeria, the hypocrisy of it. And I want to ask you, looking at corporate Nigeria, do you think that they are fulfilling their CSR to Nigeria and their customers, I mean, which is supposed to be the kings here, bearing in mind the economic situation of Nigeria? Do you think they're doing enough?
No. Very simple. There's a lot of irresponsibility. I mean, we've just talked about the weather and the rain. Now, clearly, the failure of a lot of the roads and the ditches is down to government. But how many banks have built branches with not enough parking spaces? How many fast food outlets encourage people to park their cars? How many churches have sprung up with not enough parking and blocking storm drains? You know, when you see what some of the GSM companies and the tech companies have done, they'll dig up to lay their cables, and then they don't flatten the road properly. They might do it on a Wallowa Road or Kingsway, but you get inside Orile, Oshodi, and they don't bother. And then you've got ordinary little businesses, and they've got water coming into their homes, and they've got, you know, terrible wooden creaky things over ditches that have been dug by organisations that are laying cables. So the answer is there's a lot of irresponsibility out there.
Well, never quite the insider, but an honorary Nigerian.
Thank you.
You do have quite the number of chieftaincy titles. How many do you have at the last count?
Well, I have 2 in the east, one in Lagos and one in Katsina State, Daura.
Wow. What are those titles?
So I am Eze Diaroma 1 of Enugu State.
Okay.
My first was Ikoha 1 of the Okpo Umobo Autonomous Community in Ungwa land.
Okay.
In Lagos, I am Are Baladun of Isolo Kingdom. And in Katsina, I'm Ganawan Daura.
Ganawan Daura.
Yes.
Oh, so they give you that in Daura?
Yes.
Where the president is from?
Yeah.
Yes.
Good.
So at Promasdor, we rebuilt the famous well that's part of the Hausa development story. So we rebuilt the well for the local community.
Thank you so much, Keith Richards, for coming on the show today. I hope the books are available. We can pick them up.
You can. They're in all the big bookshops and direct from Bookcraft.
Thank you. We'll make a good read. Thank you so much.